I'm 74 now, and 6 years ago I made a decision that changed my life. I cut off contact with my brother and sister. I didn't do it in anger, and I didn't do it overnight. I did it quietly after years of telling myself things would get better if I just tried harder. If that sounds harsh, I understand. For a long time, I believed family was something you endured, not something you questioned. I grew up as the middle child, which sounds harmless until you live it. I learned early how to stay quiet, how to adjust, how to smooth things over. My brother was the achiever. My sister was the favorite. I was the one who filled in the gaps. If something needed to be done, I did it. If someone needed help, I showed up. I told myself that was what family was supposed to look like. As adults, those roles never really changed. My siblings lived their lives and checked in when it suited them. I stayed close to home. When our mother's health started to decline, it wasn't even discussed who would help. I just stepped in. Doctor visits, medications, meals, long nights when she couldn't sleep. 1 year turned into 5, then 10. I didn't complain. I told myself it was temporary, that my siblings would step up eventually. They didn't. They praised me in public and disappeared in private. If someone asked how our mother was doing, they spoke as if they were deeply involved. Meanwhile, I was the one rearranging my life around her needs. I missed trips. I turned down opportunities. I told myself I would rest later. Later never came. When our mother passed away, I thought things might finally change. I thought grief would bring us closer, or at least soften things. Instead, it exposed everything I had been avoiding. The conversations turned cold and transactional. Who got what? Who deserved more? What things were worth? Years of care didn't factor into the discussion. Love didn't either. I remember sitting at my kitchen table after one of those calls, staring at the phone long after the line went dead. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from exhaustion. I felt hollow. It was the first time I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding my entire life. Why am I still doing this to myself? Even then, I didn't cut them off. I tried one more time. I explained how I felt. I spoke calmly. I didn't accuse. I just asked for basic respect. The response was silence, followed by deflection, followed by blame. Somehow the problem was still me. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, quietly. I realized that every call left me anxious. Every message tightened my chest. I was spending my remaining years bracing myself for the next disappointment. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. 6 years ago, I stopped answering. I blocked the numbers. I didn't announce it. I didn't argue. I simply chose peace. At first, the silence felt strange. Then it felt unfamiliar. And slowly, it began to feel like relief. The first few months after I cut off contact were harder than I expected. Not because I missed them, but because of the guilt. It came in waves, usually late at night when the house was quiet. I would replay old memories and ask myself if I had overreacted. I wondered if I had failed some invisible test of loyalty. Years of conditioning don't disappear just because you finally set a boundary. I kept expecting the phone to ring, not because I wanted to answer it, but because my body was used to being on alert. When it didn't ring, I felt uneasy. I had spent so much of my life responding to other people's needs that stillness felt wrong. I didn't know what to do with time that belonged only to me. Friends noticed the change before I did. They said I looked calmer, that I laughed more easily. I brushed it off at first. I told myself they were just being kind. But little things started to add up. I slept through the night. I stopped dreading holidays. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head before picking up the phone because there were no conversations to rehearse. That's when another loss hit, one I wasn't prepared for. My wife passed away 2 years after I cut off my siblings. We had been married for decades. She knew my family history better than anyone because she lived with the consequences of it. When she got sick, I didn't even consider calling my brother or sister. The thought never crossed my mind. After she died, they sent messages. Short ones, polite ones. They asked how I was doing. They said the right words, but they didn't show up. They didn't offer help. They didn't ask what I needed. It was the same pattern, just dressed up as concern. I read the messages once and didn't respond. I didn't feel guilty this time. I felt clear. Grief has a way of stripping things down to their truth. I was barely holding myself together, and the idea of managing their emotions on top of my own felt impossible. I realized something then that I wish I had understood much earlier. Love that only exists when it's convenient isn't love you can lean on. There were moments when I felt alone, but it was a clean loneliness. It didn't come with manipulation or obligation. I could sit with my grief without being pulled into old roles. I could mourn without being told to stay strong for someone else. That space mattered more than I knew at the time. People often assume cutting off family is an act of anger. For me, it was an act of preservation. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying to survive the years I had left without constantly reopening wounds that never healed. I started to understand how much energy I had been spending just staying connected. Every interaction had a cost. Once that cost was gone, I had room to breathe. I could make decisions without wondering how they would react. I could feel what I felt without apologizing for it. That's when the real work began, not with them, but with myself. I had spent a lifetime ignoring my own needs. Now I had no distractions left, and for the first time I had to face what that had done to me. After my wife passed, the quiet in the house changed. Before it had felt peaceful, now it felt empty. There's a difference between choosing silence and having it forced on you. I had long days where I didn't speak to anyone at all. At first, that scared me. I wondered if I had cut too much away. But slowly, I realized the loneliness I felt wasn't coming from the absence of my siblings. It was coming from the absence of myself. For most of my life, I had defined my worth by how useful I was to others. If someone needed help, I showed up. If there was a problem, I fixed it. Being needed made me feel safe. Without that role, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. There were mornings I woke up with no plan, no obligation, and no one waiting for me to solve something. That freedom felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. I started small. I went for walks without a destination. I sat in the park and watched people pass by. I paid attention to things I used to rush through. The way the light changed in the afternoon. The sound of leaves under my shoes. It sounds simple, but it wasn't easy. When you've spent decades putting yourself last, being present feels like breaking a rule. There were still moments when doubt crept in. I would hear about someone else's family gathering and feel a familiar ache. I questioned whether I had chosen the harder path. But every time I imagined reopening that door, my body reacted before my mind could. My chest tightened. My stomach dropped. That reaction told me more than any memory ever could. I began to see patterns I had ignored for years. How often I had excused behavior that hurt me. How quickly I took responsibility for things that weren't mine to carry. I wasn't blameless, but I had been willing to absorb far more than my share just to keep the peace. Letting go of my siblings forced me to admit that I had helped maintain a system that kept me small. That realization was painful, but it was also grounding. It gave me something solid to stand on. I stopped trying to rewrite the past. I stopped waiting for apologies that were never going to come. I accepted that they were who they were and that I was allowed to choose differently. Acceptance didn't mean approval. It meant clarity. People sometimes ask if I regret my decision. They expect a complicated answer. The truth is simpler than they imagine. I regret the years I spent hoping things would change. I regret not protecting myself sooner. I don't regret the boundary. That boundary gave me space to grieve honestly, to live quietly, and to finally listen to myself without interruption. As time passed, I noticed something else shifting. I wasn't as reactive anymore. Small problems didn't feel like emergencies. I wasn't bracing myself for the next conflict. The world felt steadier, not happier in a dramatic way, but calmer in a way that lasts. That calm didn't erase the past, but it changed how much power it had over me. And once I felt that difference, I knew I couldn't go back, even if part of me still wondered what might happen if I did. As that calm settled in, I started to notice how differently I was moving through my days. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't scanning conversations for hidden tension. Simple choices felt lighter because they belonged to me. For the first time, I could decide how I spent my time without factoring in someone else's expectations or reactions. That freedom didn't arrive all at once. It grew quietly, like something stretching after being held too tight for too long. I also began to understand how deeply my old family dynamics had shaped my thinking. I had learned to anticipate disappointment before it happened. I had learned to apologize even when I hadn't done anything wrong. Those habits didn't disappear just because I cut contact. They showed up in other relationships in small ways until I started to recognize them. Awareness came slowly, but once it did, it was hard to ignore. There were people in my life who worried about me. They asked if I was isolating myself. They wondered if I would regret being alone as I got older. I listened because their concern was genuine, but I also knew the difference between isolation and distance. Isolation feels like shrinking. Distance felt like space to breathe. I wasn't closing myself off from the world. I was choosing which parts of it I could safely let in. I reconnected with friends I had neglected over the years. Not all at once and not with big explanations, just simple check-ins, coffee, long phone calls that didn't leave me drained. These relationships felt different. There was no silent pressure. If I needed rest, I took it. If I needed company, I reached out. That balance had been missing from my life for longer than I realized. Holidays were still complicated. There were moments when old traditions tugged at me, especially during quiet evenings when memories surfaced without warning. But those moments passed more quickly than they used to. I no longer felt obligated to place myself back into situations that had consistently hurt me just to avoid feeling different. Being different stopped feeling like failure. It started to feel like honesty. One afternoon, I found myself cleaning out a drawer I hadn't opened in years. It was filled with old letters, notes, and reminders of responsibilities I had carried long after they should have been shared. I didn't throw everything away. I didn't need to. I just looked at those things and recognized how much weight they had held. Closing that drawer felt symbolic in a way I hadn't expected. Some things don't need confrontation. They just need to be acknowledged and set down. I also thought a lot about age, about how people assume time makes everything softer. In some ways it does. In others, it sharpens what was already there. Getting older didn't suddenly make my siblings kinder or more reflective. It made me less willing to keep sacrificing myself for the sake of appearances. That wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. I began to trust my internal signals again. If something felt wrong, I didn't talk myself out of it. If something felt peaceful, I stayed with it. That trust had been eroded over decades, and rebuilding it took patience. But every small choice reinforced it. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was listening. By then, I understood something important. Cutting off my siblings wasn't the end of my story. It was the point where I finally stepped into it. And once I did, I could feel another question forming, one that had nothing to do with them at all, and everything to do with how I wanted to live whatever years I had left. With that question sitting quietly in the background, I started to look at my life with more honesty than I ever had before. Not in a dramatic way and not with regret, just honestly. I paid attention to how my body felt when I said yes to things and how it felt when I said no. I noticed which conversations left me grounded and which ones drained me, even when they seemed harmless on the surface. That awareness became my guide. I stopped explaining myself so much. For years, I had felt the need to justify every choice as if my comfort needed approval. Now I let my decisions stand on their own. If someone didn't understand, I let that be their discomfort to sit with, not mine. That shift was subtle, but it changed everything. Life became quieter not because there were fewer people, but because there was less inner conflict. I also learned that peace doesn't mean the absence of pain. I still missed my wife. I still had moments when memories caught me off guard. But those feelings moved through me instead of getting stuck. I wasn't constantly reopening old wounds by placing myself back into familiar patterns. Grief had space to breathe. Healing did too. As the years passed, I felt a growing sense of steadiness. Not happiness in the way movies portray it, but a deeper sense of being settled. I trusted myself more. I didn't second-guess my reactions or minimize my experiences. I had lived long enough to know when something was wrong, and I finally respected that knowledge. Sometimes I thought about my siblings, not with anger, but with distance. I hoped they were well. I didn't need to reconnect to wish them peace. Letting go didn't require bitterness. It required acceptance. Accepting that the relationship we had was the only one they were capable of, and that it was no longer one I could carry. What surprised me most was how much lighter my life felt once I stopped trying to fix what wasn't mine to fix. I had spent decades believing endurance was the same as strength. It took most of my life to understand that real strength is knowing when to step away. Now, at this stage of my life, I don't measure my days by productivity or obligation. I measure them by how present I feel within them, by whether I can sit in my own company without tension, by whether my choices feel aligned instead of forced. Cutting off my siblings wasn't about giving up on family. It was about finally choosing myself. And in doing that, I found something I had been searching for my entire life without realizing it. A sense of peace that doesn't need to be defended, explained, or earned. Looking back now, I understand why this decision is so hard for people to talk about. We're taught that family should come before everything, no matter the cost. We're rarely taught what to do when that cost becomes your well-being. For a long time, I thought enduring pain quietly was the same thing as being loyal. It took most of my life to learn that loyalty without respect slowly erases you. I don't tell this story to convince anyone to do what I did. Every family is different and every situation has its own weight. What I do hope is that someone listening recognizes themselves in parts of it. The constant anxiety before a call, the guilt that shows up even when you know you've done nothing wrong, the exhaustion that doesn't go away with rest. Those are signals, not failures. Age has a way of narrowing your focus. You stop chasing approval. You stop explaining your choices to people who have already decided not to understand. You begin to ask simpler questions. Does this bring me peace? Does this feel safe? Do I feel respected here? If the answer is no, you start to see that walking away isn't cruel. Sometimes it's necessary. There are still quiet moments when I grieve what never was. The family I hoped for, the support I needed and didn't receive. That grief hasn't disappeared and I don't expect it to. But it no longer controls me. It sits beside gratitude for the life I've built since then. A life that feels steady. A life that feels like my own. I spend my days differently now. I move slower. I listen more. I protect my energy instead of handing it out automatically. I don't wait for permission to rest or to say no. I've learned that peace is not something you stumble into. It's something you choose again and again, even when that choice is misunderstood by others. If there's one thing I've learned in these years, it's this. You don't owe access to people who consistently harm you, even if you share a last name. You are allowed to choose calm over chaos. You are allowed to choose yourself at any age. 6 years after walking away, I don't feel regret. I feel clarity. And with that clarity came a kind of freedom I never thought I'd experience this late in life. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady peace. You don't have to agree with my choice. But I want to ask you something honestly. When certain people call you, do you feel calm? Or does your body tense up before you even answer? That feeling matters more than most people admit. If this story made you think about your own life, or reminded you of something you've been carrying quietly, you're not alone. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, about aging, family, boundaries, and finding peace later in life, you can subscribe to this channel. Thank you for listening.